Welcome, everyone. This week we are going to be talking about informed refusal. So, last time we looked at informed consent, which is the idea that a patient who is undergoing treatment or is getting healthcare deserves to consent to what they are being treated for or what procedures are done on them. And they have to do so in an informed manner, meaning they have to be able to make a decision with as much information as they can have, reasonably have. And in this chapter, we're looking at refusal. So, denying medical services, refusing treatments, making an informed choice about this, and having the autonomy to do so, right? Because we are still between that tug of war between, on the one hand, paternalism, and on the other, autonomy of the patient. And with refusal, obviously, we want to make sure that people have the right to refuse treatment if they don't want it. And there's some issues here with capacity to refuse, as well as capacity, we saw in the last chapter, capacity to consent, meaning people that aren't able to refuse or are too young to make autonomous choices. What do we do with that? But first, let's talk a little bit about death, as everyone loves to do all the time. When a person dies, they cease to exist. Obviously, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about a person, they are thinking about the death of that person. And what's important here, for our purposes, from a bioethical standpoint, is when physical death occurs. And why do we need to know that? Well, there are a lot of practical reasons we need to know that. For instance, life insurance payouts, people's estates being divided, different things that trigger on a person's death that need to be done in order to, help their loved ones out or help the grieving process start. Organs to be donated, et cetera, et cetera. And there are two criterion that have been used in the medical community, heart death and brain death. Heart death is the simple cessation of spontaneous function of the cardiac and respiratory systems, meaning that when your heart stops and you aren't breathing anymore, the automatic functions of those two systems, you are considered dead. Brain death is a different focus on the death of all functions of the entire brain, irreversible loss, they call it. And this was adopted in the 80s to supplement the heart death common law standard. How exactly do we determine that there's this irreversible loss? Well, there are these four conditions. One, there's no reflexes or spontaneous respiratory or muscular movements. There's no response to painful stimuli. There's confirmation by an EEG. And there's no extenuating factors like drug intoxication or hypothermia or something that would give false indications of little to no activity, wherein they might, eventually reverse and reset themselves, right? And we get this interesting case of Karen Quinlan to start off. We'll talk a little bit about this because I think it illustrates a key dichotomy between a persistent vegetative state and death or brain death completely. So Karen Quinlan in 1974 was in a coma and didn't have any fully formed brain waves. So the EEG showed no fully formed brain waves. I don't know if you've ever seen the markings of an EEG, but I could put a little picture up here. You can see there's the waves rather than the, in this, it would be like short bursts of, they call it small spikes of activity on the EEG. So she had small spikes because the autonomous, the parts of the brain that are keeping the brain stem that are keeping her alive, that are running, say, the respiratory and circulatory systems, those were working and they had activity. So she was functionally alive, biologically alive, but had no activity in the upper areas of the brain that are associated with consciousness and conscious thought. So this is what's called a persistent vegetative state. So it's in which substantial losses of functions in the cerebral cortex occur, but autonomous functions of the brain continue because there is little to no damage to the brainstem. Little or no damage to the brainstem. Is someone in a persistent vegetative state legally dead? Many bioethicists, and I think I tend towards this side, and not to bias you either way, but I think that there's something about which when we say someone is no longer living, we're talking about that person, their conscious thought, the stuff that makes up their identity. I don't tend to think of me as being my body serves an important purpose for the rest of that, right? But I don't think of me being strictly identified with the goings on of my respiratory and circulatory systems. I tend to think of my identity as being, my conscious thought and my, the activity of my brain, right? That's really what I am as a person. And I think this is sort of illustrated with people who, if you have ever been unfortunate enough to have someone that you know or care about have Alzheimer's, I think a lot of people, when going through that, they say like they're not really that person anymore. They've lost, whether it's their character or their memories or their personality. They've substantially changed in a way that they're no longer the same person. But so there's that difference between the brain activity that keeps our autonomous, heart and our breathing going, and the brain death that involves conscious thought and or the persistent vegetative state, which is just damage to the conscious thought areas. 2021 playoffs, the Phoenix Suns were playing the Dallas Mavericks in a game seven and were trailing 57-27 at halftime. That's pretty brutal. And, watching in the third quarter, you might have thought seeing a Suns player score, that's just a futile attempt at winning at this point. There's no way you're coming back. The lead is insurmountable. You can't, whatever scoring you're going to do here is futile. And just a little mean-spirited jab at the Suns there, but you can see that futility here is in relation to some goal. So scoring is futile only in such that it's in relation to winning the game. If it was, say, to pad a player's stats or to score a certain number of points in the game, those goals might be reachable. But winning the game maybe is out of reach and futile to score at that point, right? So the idea here for medical futility is that certain treatments might be futile in the face of a patient's condition, or it might be futile at some point because the patient condition is at such a point that there's no coming back from it. But there's the definition that the text uses is that medical futility refers to treatment that is ineffective, medically harmful, or inappropriate. And you can tell that this is sort of, you can see what they're getting at, but it also allows for a lot of like borderline cases. And of course, that's exactly what we're going to explore here is what different types of futility there are and whether there's wiggle room on them, right? So we have the three types of futility that they talk about in the text. The first is physiological or strict futility. Now, this type of futility is for treatment or care that is just not going to help. It is physiologically or strictly futile. It just doesn't, maybe there's no evidence for it, or it just is the wrong kind of care to help to begin with. But this is a futile that is more black and white than the other two. The next one is quantitative futility. And quantitative futility says, look, there is a small chance that this might succeed. Maybe it's like, we don't have to set an exact number on it, but you can think like 99 times out of 100, this thing's going to fail. It's not going to work. Maybe there's a long shot case in which it might succeed, but it's quantitatively futile. And I think when thinking about this in terms of treatment, you have to think about the other costs that are associated with that treatment. Because it's not just financial costs and it's not just the exertion or the effects that it's going to have on the patient themselves, but it's also the doctors and nurses and staff's time, the opportunity cost of giving you this treatment when they could be treating or giving that person the treatment when they could be treating someone else that's maybe not in such a futile place. So the trade-off here, right, is always going to be a measure of is this going to make this patient's life better? Is it going to make their condition better? Is it going to improve their well-being or improve their general health? Or is it, such a long shot and so little help, and maybe there are even some harmful risks for it. So you have to always weigh these two things, right? The costs of this treatment against the chances of its having success. And the third type of futility is perhaps the most uh, you can disagree the most on whether or not a case is going to fit it, which is qualitative futility. The treatment is likely to work or it has a reasonably good chance of working, but the purpose of the treatment may be deemed improper. So you can think of someone who maybe has advanced Alzheimer's, and I don't mean to keep harping on this single condition, but it's a brutal condition, and it's a good example of someone being in probably a lot of pain and suffering. So extending their life, maybe offering a patient in the later stages of Alzheimer's life-extending treatment might be deemed inappropriate because you're going to prolong their suffering, right? If this person is in the later stages of Alzheimer's and maybe like before, we don't even think that it's necessarily the same person because they've suffered and their position or their condition has degraded to such an extent that they're no longer recognizable. But you can think of that as being qualitative futility. Maybe this life-extending treatment for something else might actually prolong their life, but is that the appropriate thing to do for someone that has later stages of Alzheimer's and seems to be suffering a great deal? Maybe or maybe not, right? And I think reasonable people can disagree about that. And we can disagree again about these qualitative types of futility. I think you could disagree about any of them, but you can see that this is probably the most contentious, the most open for interpretation, and probably the hardest to apply for healthcare professionals and people that are trying to make these decisions, right? So let's take a quick look at this Helga Wengel case. I don't want to look at all of the individual court cases and the legal precedents. I don't think I'm much of a help there, and I would just be parroting what they're saying back to you. But I can expand on these ethical issues and stuff a lot, and that's what I want to focus on in this class is the ethical issues. The legal stuff is good because it goes hand in hand a lot. It's our way of trying to it's a way of building out those ethical foundations into medical practice by legalizing it or by making standards or by giving guides to how to make these difficult decisions. But Helga Wengel is an 86-year-old was an 86-year-old that is being kept alive in a persistent vegetative state. Her husband was her surrogate and thought she might recover, even though he knew the doctors didn't agree with him. The medical team thought that her treatment was futile. They thought there's no way she's coming back from this. We're just prolonging the biological function of her life, but she's going to have a really terrible quality of life. And the husband doesn't want to take her off life support. So the question is this treatment futile? We have the Schneider, Jecker, and Johnson group that says any treatments which merely prolong dying are futile if the treatment is not ameliorating or correcting any of the comatose patient's like life-threatening conditions, then they are futile as well. So the thought is, if you're just prolonging dying of this patient in a persistent vegetative state, it's futile. It's inappropriate. It's not medically reasonable because it's not improving their condition. It's not ameliorating or helping to fix the things that put them in this comatose state, and it's merely prolonging the function of their autonomous systems, respiratory and circulatory. But that person's, according to this view, that person is no longer there, and therefore we're not really treating them or helping them. We're just prolonging their biological functioning. On the other hand, Brody argues, this is another author who argues against this view, saying that the treatment did exactly what it was designed to do, prolong life. Now, you might not agree with that goal, says Brody. You might think that prolonging life is maybe inappropriate in this case, or not a good goal to have, but those values are what we should measure futility against, not the idea that it's saving the person, or that the conscious thought is what's really important. So Bertie's saying, look, you have this assumption that everyone's going to share this idea of the conscious thought, or the upper brain being what's important for personal identity, and maybe not everyone shares that value, and futility shouldn't be a measure against a value that maybe not everyone shares. And Brody suggests that what happens when something's genuinely futile is when the person or a patient or a surrogate demands treatment that simply won't work. But again, work here is dependent on whatever goal that person has, right? It's not just work to keep their conscious thought intact or ameliorate the conditions that help their personhood come back. It's whatever that goal happens to be. And I think the SJJ team would come back to this and think, look, again, merely prolonging life simply isn't it doesn't serve any medical purpose, because we're not treating simply the circulatory and respiratory systems of a person. We're trying to treat people. And that, I think that would be the response there. So you can see the two different ways of looking at futility. Is it in relation to whatever goal you may have, or should there really be a focus on the goal to help the person and to help the health of that person? We can think about a little bit of the policies on futility. We don't need to spend too much time on it here, but the AMA has some general guidelines that do, in fact, emphasize the value judgments of patients and taking those into consideration. And I think what's really interesting is this Texas statute that helps ameliorate or helps adjudicate disagreements between a healthcare professional and a patient, or their surrogate in this case, usually. So imagine that a doctor is like we don't have to imagine, we can think about the Helga Engel case, where Helga's husband disagrees with her healthcare team about the treatment. Texas statute says, look, send it to this committee. We're going to have a committee of probably bioethicists, doctors, and experts, and they're going to look at it, and what do they think? They're going to take into consideration the values of the husband. They're going to take into consideration, all of the things that we were just talking about, and come back with a decision. If the committee agrees with the doctor has to find someone that's willing to try to find someone that's willing to do the treatment. And if not, then, after a certain time, it's discontinued. The life-saving or, life-extending treatment would be discontinued. Harsh, maybe, but at the same time, I think it's a good way of resolving a dispute, and a genuine dispute where maybe a doctor doesn't want to do something that they see as prolonging suffering in someone, where the patient surrogate wants to see that person kept alive at all costs or something like that, right? So we can see some interesting ways in which these ethical considerations are actually put into law. They're actually enforced, or rather not enforced, they're legislated. And there's a committee that's there to help adjudicate those decisions. So interesting. Let's move on and talk about euthanasia. So in the text, we get this differentiation between passive and active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is withholding or withdrawing life support from a patient who is in a terminal condition. So say you're in you have a patient that is in a persistent vegetative state, and you take them off life support. That would be passive euthanasia, because you are withdrawing support that would otherwise perhaps keep them alive for a while longer. euthanasia being the act of uh, letting someone die in medical care, or in active euthanasia case, actually administering lethal dose of some sort of drug to induce death, kill that person. Um, Kill here being probably perhaps not the right word, or perhaps the right word, depending on your view, right? The thought is for active euthanasia, it's the active administration of a lethal drug or whatever manner is used in that case to kill someone or to help someone die. Physician assisted suicide, right? Um, and uh, Physician assisted suicide is a criminal felony in most of the United States. There are a few states that are exceptions to this, but it is usually seen as it is viewed as a felony in law. Um, the text sort of jumps around here a bit, and I think it's useful at least to think about um, what exactly is at stake here, right? Because we've talked about medically futile treatments. Here, there's this issue of uh, whether or not it's okay to help someone end their lives if they decide that they want to do that. And I think there's the ethics of um, actually killing someone or setting a precedent for ending someone's life. And then on the other hand, the view that I think like Kevorkian and these other people who have admitted or have helped in physician-assisted suicide would view it as a way of helping someone avoid more suffering or helping someone uh, shorten the amount of pain, immense pain that they will have to endure for the rest of their lives. Um, and, they, real quickly, we can talk about this doctrine of the double effect. I put in the notes that it doesn't seem strictly relevant to me. I think it might, well, let's just explain it and then we talk about a little bit whether or not it's relevant. So the doctrine of double effect was from Thomas Aquinas, who is perhaps famous for Catholics and philosophers, who had this idea about the effects and unintended effects of an action. So this quote that I had in the notes is from Aquinas that says, "Nothing hinders one act from having two effects, only one of which is intended, while the other is beside the intention. So accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. One, the saving of one's life, and the other, the slaying of the aggressor." And what Aquinas is saying here is the intended effect is to save one's life. When maybe I kill in self-defense, but what I'm trying to do is stay alive, right? If I'm in say I'm in the Wild West and someone draws a gun on me and I draw it faster and am able to save my life by acting. The unintended effect, or it's not the goal of my action to kill that person, but it is to stop them, right? And what Aquinas is saying here is that the other unintended effect isn't something that one should be held morally responsible for, because, or whether it should be weighed differently than the intention of that act, right? The thought is, when someone, say you have two people that are being charged with murder, and one of them says, "Look, I was trying to save my own life. I was in a terrible situation and I didn't know what to do. I attacked them and killed them." The other person just admits to, maybe say in a fit of rage, killing someone. We tend to think that the first case is morally superior or less bad maybe than the other case because the intention there was not a bad one. It was a one that we all share, and I would think is a good intention to save your own life, to preserve your own life. But the unintended effect is resulting in the death of another person. So I think the text here thinks we can look at this as a physician who's administering, say, morphine to a patient that's dying, and when they administer a dose, maybe it unintentionally kills them. Well, sure, but that's not really what's at issue with euthanasia, right? Because euthanasia is very purposeful and it's very methodical. There is a certain level, certain dosage that you are administering in a certain time frame with certain procedures behind it. So I get that they're trying to say that maybe there's something here about the intention of euthanasia being to prevent suffering, but they're also very much intending for that person to die. In fact, that's the only way they see in which to um, get the goal of reducing the suffering of that person. And maybe there's something there in the double effect, right? That the real goal here is the reduction of suffering. And it's true that killing is a necessary way to get that done, or causing the death of another person is a necessary way to get that done. But we should be looking at this under the lens of that first primary goal of reducing suffering. Um, and you can do with that what you will. I think that's a decent way of looking at the euthanasia debate, but um, you know, everyone obviously is going to come with their own opinions to this, and I'd be interested to hear it from you guys in the discussion forums. I'm excited to read that. Let's talk a little bit about these treatment involving decisions for children. So the last thing we'll cover is decision making for children, because children are unable to make a lot of informed medical decisions, at least within certain bounds. Obviously, older children might be, or if they're emancipated minors and they're of a certain age where they can understand. Set that aside. Let's think about infants and small children that can't make those decisions for themselves, whether they can't be informed or they just have the inability to make the decision generally. And there's a interesting intersection between obviously the two polar ideas of autonomy and paternalism, where paternalism here is a very literal sense of the parents, but also just parents' rights. Do people have a right to raise their children in the way that they see fit, even if they hold very different values than the rest of society, even if they have values that maybe we see as very extreme? And there's, especially when we're thinking about medical care, there's a lot on the line here. Like, these are weighty decisions that could influence the life and death of these children, their general well-being for the rest of their lives. And I think a cool one of the cases that we'll talk about for a little bit here is this Muhlenberg Hospital versus Patterson. So a child needed a blood transfusion. There was a risk of severe brain damage, perhaps irreversible brain damage, and the parents objected to it because they were against blood transfusions. The court actually approved the blood transfusion. And the reasoning here was society as a whole has a stake in whether or not that children has serious brain damage. It would be a bad thing for the whole of society if more children were subjected to serious brain damage, right? They have an interest in the welfare of that child because they are a contributing, or they will be a contributing member of society if they are already, and we have a stake at their well-being. Just as, and you can see this reasoning elsewhere with blood transfusions or other life-saving treatments for infants. Interestingly, in things like school choice or being homeschooled in these extreme values, courts generally go the opposite way and suggest that parents have a right to do that, and that it may be a very different value system, but they are not suffering. They are not, their well-being is not being infringed upon in a way that the court can do something about. There's a lot of room for debate there, obviously, about whether that's okay, but I think with the decisions involving children in a medical context, there is perhaps a more defined line of what's going to be necessary to prevent serious loss of functionality or loss of quality of life, brain damage being obviously a huge one. And so we can there's all of these court cases that decide what exact limits are placed on each of those. You can see those in the text again. I don't want to parrot legal decisions back to you. It's just not going to make for very engaging lecture material, and I don't think it's necessary for us here. But we can again see that this tug of war between autonomy and paternalism, and I think especially when talking about a child and their welfare, um, you can see that maybe there's a moral duty for other people to make sure that they aren't harmed. Just as if parents were abusing their children, we have a interest in society to stop that abuse, right? And that goes too far afield of the child's well-being to fall under this umbrella of paternal rights. Well, this has been a relatively quick video, but I think given the cheery nature of this, that's okay. That'll be all for informed refusal. I hope you guys I at least enjoy the material. I think it's a really interesting discussion and an important one, right? About the end of people's lives, how we handle that in regards to medical care, how we reduce the suffering, how we make that experience perhaps better for everyone involved, or hopefully. But go ahead and take the quiz, do the discussion post if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next video. Thanks.